Okay, we'll get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Aurélien Kriat from the University of Nice, which is also where he started his PhD there, and over to Germany, Cambridge, the Triangle back in Nice, where he's faculty member now. And he also works at the Institut Universitaire de France.
Yes, this one.
He's made some huge contributions to our understanding of solar system formation and planet-disk interactions, most notably for how giant planets open gas and disks in the sun and Earth. And he's here to tell us on how we can make moons of rings.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here at CITA. I'm proud of my mug now. I will bring it back to France. And I will tell you about the formation of moons out of rings, in particular in the case of Saturn. And this is a work I did in tight collaboration with Sébastien Charnoz, who actually initiated this work. And so this will be a presentation of everything we did in this frame since 6 years now. To start with, let me introduce the system of Saturn to you. So Saturn is this beautiful planet which has a radius of 60,000 kilometers, so much larger than the Earth, which you can see here to scale. The mass of Saturn is 6 × 10⁻26 kilograms. Let me give some numbers so that you have an idea. And of course, most notably, Saturn has rings. That's why Saturn is so well known and so fascinating to work on. The diameter of the rings is 272,000 kilometers for a thickness of about 30 meters, which makes the rings of Saturn the thinnest object known. There's nothing as thin as Saturn's rings in the universe. The aspect ratio, the thickness divided by the diameter, is 10⁻⁷. So if you would like to make a miniature of the Saturn's rings taking a paper, a letter format or A4 paper, you cut it around about this, and you have the round of the Saturn's rings. Then you have to split it in 40,000 in the width to mimic Saturn's rings. They are so thin because they are made mainly of ice blocks, almost pure water ice blocks. You could just pick one and put it in your glass. Actually, some of them are just the size of an ice cube, and they are mostly of the order of the meter size. That's the ring. And if you move a little bit away from Saturn, there is a very tiny ring called the F ring, which is shepherded by two moons called Prometheus and Pandora, who orbit just around the F ring. That's just at 140,000 kilometers from Saturn's center, so just a little bit outside of the main rings. These moons are just 80 kilometers in size and have masses of the order of 10⁻17 kilograms. A little bit beyond them, you find Janus and Epimetheus, who are larger, about 100 or 200 kilometers. Their masses are close to 10⁻18 kilograms, and they orbit the rings at 151,000 kilometers. They orbit Saturn, at 151 kilometers, which puts them about 11,000 kilometers from the ring. And I say they orbit at this distance because they share the same orbit. Janus and Epimetheus are the only known system in mutual horseshoe orbit, which is represented here. This is a co-rotating frame, so a frame that rotates around Saturn at the average speed of Janus and Epimetheus. And this frame, here are the positions of Janus and Epimetheus on July 1st, 2004, here. So Janus was a little bit outside of the average orbit, while Epimetheus was a little bit inside. So Janus was moving a little bit backwards, while Epimetheus was moving a little bit forward. They approach each other, they exchange orbit, and then the same thing happens again every 4 years. I will come back to this later. If we keep moving away from Saturn in the system, we travel, we see MyMass. MyMass is a round body of 400 kilometers in diameter. It's 37 times 10⁻18 kilograms, and it's located even further, so as the numbers say. MyMass also looks a little bit like the Death Star with this cool crater here, which is called the Herschel crater. Another fascinating moon is Enceladus. You've all heard of Enceladus's plume and geysers. It's larger than MyMass, and it's further too. It's also bigger in mass, about 10⁻20 kilograms. If we keep moving, we have Tethys. Tethys is 1,000 kilometers in diameter now, and 610 to the 18 kilograms, and it's located exactly, or almost exactly, 300,000 kilometers away from the center of Saturn. Dione is even bigger, even further, and we have this beautiful picture taken by Cassini where Dione is passing in front of the globe of Saturn, which gives you actually a very wrong idea of the relative sizes, because of course Dione is much closer. Dione is tiny compared to Saturn. But what I love in this picture is that you see the rings almost edge-on here. Not exactly edge-on, otherwise you would not even see them. And the rings project shadows on Saturn, which appear as this beautiful curve here. Even further, we have Rhea. Rhea is the biggest of all these moons and the furthest. And on this picture, you don't only see Rhea, you actually see the rings, seen edge-on. It was not a line just to underline the distance to the rings. This is the rings. And you can see actually 5 moons in total on this picture. Can you recognize them now? Let me help you. Of course, it's unrecognizable, but this is Thetis, Epimetheus. Prometheus is this tiny spot here, and Dione is in the background. But okay, this is not just about beautiful pictures. Let's put this in a more mathematical way on this diagram, where you see the mass of the satellite as a function of the distance to Saturn's center. This is how the system looks like. So Saturn is 60,000 kilometers diameter. That's the bulk of Saturn, in radius, sorry. After that, you have the ring, which extend all the way up to about 140,000 kilometers. And then the satellites are placed like this. There seems to be kind of a nice curve, right? Actually, if you plot the satellites not as a function of their distance to Saturn, but as a function of their distance to the rings now, well, in this log-log plot, they are pretty well aligned. I don't know what you think, but for me, this means there is something, some connection between the rings and the satellites. And this is what I'm going to tell you now. So where do these satellites come from? The classical idea, the standard picture, is that planets form in a disk of gas and dust, the so-called protoplanetary disks. And if you put a giant planet in a protoplanetary disk, like here Jupiter around the Sun in this numerical simulation, you see that the gas is repelled away from the orbit of the planet. As Matt mentioned, this is something I have worked on a lot. And around the planet, if you zoom into this simulation, you see that the streamlines of the gas orbit around the giant planet. So there is a circumplanetary disk in which you could form satellites pretty much in the same way that you form planets around the star, you could form satellites around a giant planet. It's not exactly the same way, but the literature mainly focuses on this idea. But this model cannot explain the mass distance feature I've just mentioned. This feature doesn't appear in the solar system. There's no reason why, if you form things in such a disk, they should have their mass as a function of the distance to the rings, which seems to be a power law. So to understand what's going on, let's start from the basics. So I'm sure everyone understands what I'm talking about. Kepler's law, you must have heard of that guy. He said that the cube of the radius of an orbit is proportional to the square of the period. That is a famous law, which means the angular velocity around a central body reads like this, the square root of j times the mass of the central body divided by the orbital radius cubed. So the angular velocity decreases with r, which means the further you are, the slower you rotate. But now if you consider the angular momentum is r squared omega, and so it's proportional to the square root of r. So the further you are, the more angular momentum you have. And this leads to some kind of contradiction, or at least counterintuitive effect, which is that when you take two ring particles, the inner one goes faster, so it tends to accelerate the outer one. Any kind of interaction between these particles, whether it's gravitational or physical collision, or if you have some viscosity in gas, some friction between the two rings, the inner thing which is going faster is going to give angular momentum to the outer body which is going slower. But the outer body already had more angular momentum, so it is transferring angular momentum from the inside to the outside. As the outside gains angular momentum, it will need to orbit further. If you increase the angular momentum, you must increase r. as the inner part loses angular momentum, it needs to orbit closer. And so these things are going to separate, and this makes rings spread. It's a well-known phenomenon. Every ring in astrophysics, in Keplerian rotation, spread. Another thing I need to remind you about is the Roche radius. Consider two spheres, say two ice cubes, orbiting around Saturn. Two spheres of radius A orbiting around the central mass m at a distance r with a global angular velocity omega given by Kepler's law. The inner ball here feels a stronger gravity than the outer one, as sketched by the red arrow, but the centrifugal force which balances the gravity is stronger for the outer ball than for the inner one, as sketched by the blue arrow. So in total, if you place yourself in the frame co-rotating with the two balls, the inner one feels the net force inwards and the outer one feels a net force outwards. An easy first order Taylor expansion of the gravity force and centrifugal force gives you the value of this force, which is called the tidal force. This is tides. That's why there are tides on the Earth's ocean. And that's its expression, proportional to the size of these two balls and having nothing to do with recomposition. Now, if you compare this tidal force to the self-gravity that the two balls exert on each other, you can do a very easy calculation that tells you that this aggregate is stable, this formation, if and only if the self-gravity force which binds them together is stronger than the tidal force which is pulling them apart. And the math gives this condition: the distance to the central body should be larger than 9m over pi rho, where rho is the density of these balls, to the power 1/3, which is called the Roche radius. Easy numerical application: take the mass of Saturn, the density of ice, of porous ice, you get a Roche radius of 140,000 kilometers. Good number, it's exactly the outer edge of the rings. The rings are inside this radius, and so Roche concluded that this is why Saturn's rings remain as rings, and all these ice cubes don't agglomerate into one single moon, which they should for gravity. So to illustrate this, there is a movie I can show you here, which is a numerical simulation performed by Hanno Rein, who is at the Scarborough here, and which should open. Yes, come on. That's a movie in which every white particle is an ice particle around Saturn. We are orbiting at Keplerian velocity just above this blue spot, and so what we see at first sight is the Keplerian shear. The inside towards Saturn is orbiting faster than us, the outside is orbiting slower than us, so seems to be left behind as we are moving on our orbit around Saturn. And the second thing that you see is that all these particles, they try to aggregate. They are attracted by each other, and so they form little concentrations, and these concentrations are then teared apart by the tides, which elongates them, and eventually they are destroyed. This simulation, which is a real 3D simulation, even if the configuration is pretty flat, is actually pretty realistic, and this is probably what is happening in the A ring of Saturn. These such concentrations, elongated shape in diagonal, have been detected. So that's the rings because of the tides.
What's the effective cube you're very large?
Tomb Rescue?
Yeah.
Tomb Rescue is small. So the rings are very much self-gravitating.
Okay.
If you did not have the tides of Saturn, they would really agglomerate. The velocity dispersion is tiny because all the collisions among these particles are dissipative. So in the end, they just have their orbital velocity almost.
But I was wondering the simulation, what cube values.
In this simulation, I can't tell you, but it must be set roughly to the parameters of Saturn's rings, as far as I remember. Okay, so let's put everything together. We have seen that the rings spread, and that beyond the Roche radius, self-gravity should win. That's the definition of the Roche radius. So what happens when the rings spread beyond the Roche radius? I'm asking you, they will form new satellites. The material of the rings, as soon as it crosses the Roche limit, will be free to finally agglomerate into a satellite that will not be destroyed by tides, like that. And then this satellite is orbiting even slower, because it's even further than the ring's particles. So the interaction between the satellite and the ring leads to a positive torque felt by the satellite. It gains angular momentum and it is migrating outwards, moving away from the ring. Okay? Now, this total torque, the formula has been computed by Lin and Papaloizou in 79. It's proportional to the mass of the satellite squared and to the distance to the rings, normalized by the Roche radius, to the power -3, which means the bigger satellites migrate faster, but the further you go away, the slower you migrate. If you make a numerical application to the case of Janus, you find that Janus must have been in the rings something like 100 million years ago. That's the order of magnitude. So Janus cannot be a primordial object. Because it's located so close to the rings, it's moving away very fast. So it must have been in the rings inside the Roche radius a short time ago. So we did numerical simulations of Saturn's rings as they are now, spreading by just the viscous spreading that we can simulate numerically easily. And when mass is crossing the Roche radius, it's transformed into moonlets, and then we integrate the evolution of the moonlets. And on these snapshots, you see the density profile of the rings and the formation of the satellites. The mass of the satellites is left, so there is a right-hand Y scale, and this is the distance to the center of Saturn. And we get with this the rings and the formation of a handful of small satellites whose masses and the number correspond quite well to Prometheus, Pandora, Epimetheus, and Janus that I've just introduced to you.
So the mass evolution comes from the loss of the surface density in the ring,
The mass evolution of the rings?
of the moonlets.
Not exactly. The moonlets, as soon as they are formed here, they just go away.
Yeah.
But then another one is coming and they merge.
But the furthest one is the most massive.
Yes.
The rings were most massive when that one formed. Is that the reason, or is it?
Okay, not exactly. There is some truth in this, but that's not the whole story, because when they go away, actually they slow down, and so they kind of pack and they merge. And this is the main reason of why they grow. I will come back to this. So the furthest are the most massive because they have accumulated many merging events.
So the rings are being treated here as discrete particles, or is it?
No, here it's just a 1D model of sigma, the surface density of the rings as a function of r, in which we include the viscous torque. And then we compute what goes out of the grid to make the satellites.
But how do you handle the growth of the innermost moon?
It's very approximate in that we have a kind of ghost cell here, and everything that goes in the ghost cell is transformed into a moon. And then this moon evolves under the torque given by the formula.
But is the moon mass then dependent on resolution in any way, or?
Maybe, but I think it's robust in that anyway moons eventually merge. None of these moons is original from this. So maybe instead of being just one, it could have been 10 that merge anyway. It would not change. Good point. Go. And this idea that these small moons are formed from the spreading of the ring actually explains many of the surprising properties of these small moons. These small moons are underdense. Their density is estimated to be only of the order of 600 kilograms per cubic meter, which is porous ice, and which is exactly what you expect if you pile ice cubes. They have the same spectrum as the rings as well, all these satellites. So they seem to be made of the same material. They are dynamically young in the sense I explained that Janus cannot be as old as the solar system, considering where it is now. It must have formed recently. And their surfaces look young also. So this was the first paper we published on this in 2010. But then let's do a bit of math about what's going on here. I have a mathematical formation background, so now I will take you into equations, but easy equations, don't worry. And it's worth it, I promise. let's note T, TR, the orbital period at the Roche radius, which we call RR, and we call F the flow through the Roche radius, the flow of mass from the ring through the Roche radius, which we will assume constant in this model. Then we can define the lifetime of the disk as the mass of the disk divided by the flow it loses, normalized by the orbital period here. And if we consider a viscosity given by Daisaka et al., who did a study on the Saturn's rings processes, then we can estimate tau, the lifetime of the disk, as a function of d, which is the mass of the disk, normalized by the mass of the central planet. If we do not make this assumption, then tau is arbitrary. But if we use Daisaka's viscosity, tau is a function of d. So in what follows, what is black is general, and what is blue relies on this assumption of Daisaka's viscosity. The rest is pure mathematics. You have one satellite forming. Assume as the ring spread only one satellite form. Then the mass of this satellite is necessarily F times T. Right? You integrate a flow of mass F into one satellite. Its mass is F times T, where you started the simulation. Now, this satellite feels this torque from the disk, the standard formula. And if you input here F times T, you can integrate this, and you get a migration rate of the satellite because the torque transfers into orbital angular momentum, so variation of the three major axes, which gives you this differential equation, which is relatively easy to integrate. And the solution of this is that the mass of the satellite becomes proportional to the square of the distance. So this satellite is going to move away from the disk, from the rings, and as it moves away, it grows, and it grows at the distance squared. So in a mass-distance diagram, these are possible tracks followed by the satellite. So we call this the continuous regime because in this case, the satellite is growing continuously, m is F times T, and it goes away. Now this holds as long as the satellite captures immediately the material going through the Roche radius. The satellite will be able to capture everything that is coming through the Roche limit if and only if the distance between the satellite and the Roche limit is less than 2 Hill radii, the Hill radius being the radius of gravitational influence of the satellite. This transfers into a condition on delta as a function of q, and if you input this condition into the equation setting the mass as a function of distance, you see that there is a limit. The continuous regime is valid only if delta is smaller than a critical delta value or q is smaller than a critical mass, it's the same, which is the intersection between the parabola and the q to the power 3 curve here. So once this critical distance or mass has been reached, the satellite is not growing anymore. So in this diagram, it stays on a horizontal line, constant mass, but it's still migrating away because it feels the torque from the disk. Right? So what's going on? Once this satellite is gone, the rings keep spreading. So a new satellite should form at the Roche radius. And this new satellite, which is now this one, is migrating away from the disk, and it's migrating super fast because it has a tiny delta. So it will enter in the feeding zone of the first satellite and be eaten by him. Then another new satellite is going to form, migrate away, be eaten by that one, and so on. So in the end, the first satellite is still accreting at the same time. All the mass is going into this satellite, but step by step. So we call this the discrete regime because it's not continuous anymore, but it's basically the same thing. But at some point, this satellite will be so far away that this will not happen anymore. There will be that satellite will be in the discrete regime. This one will just go away. What's the condition for this? It's again that the distance delta is smaller than the critical distance for the continuous regime for the first satellite plus 2 times the 2 Hill radii. So it's about for satellites that are 10 times larger than at the end of the continuous regime or 3 times further. And this lasts about 100 orbits if you assume Daisaka's viscosity. Now let's do the numbers. If we take Saturn's rings, the critical mass at the end of the discrete regime is 10 to the minus 18 times the mass of the central body, times the mass of Saturn. So actually, we've only formed tiny things absolutely useless. Too bad. So what's going on after that? Well, you are producing all these satellites of mass, the critical mass at the end of the discrete regime. They are all produced here at the same mass, and they go away. And regularly, as the rings spread, you produce a new one that is going away, and a new one that is going away. All these satellites have the same mass. As they go away, they slow down, so they approach each other, and they eventually merge. So a little bit further, you will have satellites of 2 times the critical mass for the discrete regime. As they are more massive, they go further, faster. 2 new satellites come, merge, become 2 times the mass of the critical mass of the end of the discrete regime, go away, catch up with the first one, merge, become 4 times more massive, and so on, and so on. So we have here a pyramidal regime in which the satellites merge in pairs of satellites of same mass. And it's a hierarchical situation where you produce small satellites, they go further, they merge, these ones go further, merge, these ones go further, merge, and so on. Now, if we do a bit more equations, a little bit more complicated, so I don't write them here, we use the migration rate, and we can show that in this regime, when the mass is doubled, delta, the distance, should be multiplied by 2 to the power 5/9, which means in the pyramidal regime, the further satellites are more massive, which answers your question, and they are more massive in a way that Q, the mass, is proportional to the distance to the rings to the 9/5. On top of that, the number density of satellites should be proportional to 1 over delta. So you would have a pileup of small satellites close to the ring and less satellites when you go further. Now, if we go beyond the 2-to-1 mean motion, Lindblad resonance with the edge of the rings, which is delta is about half, then the interaction with the rings will vanish, and you will need to use another process for the migration of the satellites, which is the tides, the planetary tides with Saturn. Similarly, as our moon is going away from Earth, all the moons on Saturn's system are going away from Saturn, and they are going away following this equation. With this equation, you find another relationship between the mass and the distance, but it's similar. Now, we have a law that says what the mass should be at a given distance, and let's put it in the diagram. I call this a nice fit. Let's seriously be honest, there are worse fits in astrophysics. In my opinion, this kind of confirms and suggests strongly that all these satellites formed by the spreading of moons of the rings and the formation of moons at the Roche limit as the rings spread.
Should you even include Titan in that?
Well, Titan is not on the straight line, right? But as beyond the straight line, beyond a certain delta, it's not anymore a straight line, it's not proportional to delta, but to r to the power 3/9, the curve goes to Titan, yes. It's not my fault. It's it's there.
How much is the total mass of the moon compared with the current ring mass?
Excellent question. At present, the mass of the rings is the mass of my mass.
Right. So that doesn't. But in your calculations, you assume the ring mass is constant, ring substance is constant, is that right?
Yes. It simplifies the calculation, and indeed, it's probably not true because the ring mass must have been more massive in the past. I'm coming back to this.
Just also a quick
Yes.
question about the transition in the dominant torque.
Yes.
I understand there's something special about 2 to 1, but Saturn is so much more massive than the rings. It's not obvious to me that the Lindblad torques, exerted by interaction in the rings of the planet and the satellites become unimportant just at 2 to 1.
You're right. We did the calculation with the present rings. The ring dominate almost all the way to the 2 to 1. Not exactly. If the rings were a bit more massive, they dominate all the way to the 2 to 1. Of course, if the planetary tides dominate over the rings tide, then you get the same curve, except the transition between the straight line and the curve would be shifted a little bit inward. Yes,
Also, the ring torque is not continuous to the one, right? It's more
absolutely. It's continuous with this.
maybe to 10 to 9 or something.
Yes, or very close to continuous, up to 6 to 7
And then
roughly.
it gets stuck.
And then it's just that you have the torque from each individual resonance, and as soon as one resonance falls off the ring, the torque discontinuously has a small
Yeah.
diminishing, but roughly speaking, it follows the same tendency. In the Meyer-Vernez-Siccardi paper, 87, they have this curve of the real torque as divided by this smooth expression here, equation 1. And it's almost flat, and you get wiggles at resonances. So yes, this would change a little bit the picture, but not much. I mentioned here a recent observation by Carl Murray and collaborators of an object at the edge of the rings, which seems, so of course the object is not this. This is kind of a cloud of dust created by the perturbation by, they suppose, an object. The size of this object is a bit larger, they estimate, as the size it should have at the end of the discrete regime. And two of such things have been seen, and they seem to have had a collision when we reconstruct the orbits. And after, there's only one. So what they see in this paper looks very much like the pyramidal regime going on just at the edge of the rings now. It's not clear. There are just a few observations of two objects, but still, when I saw that, I liked it a lot. Now, of course, you are critical. Can this be true? I mean, I've shown a nice curve, a nice fit, but was there enough mass in the rings? That's, of course, the first question. And was there enough time to do that within the edge of the solar system? That's the second question you should ask. And I'm going to answer yes to both of them. Just spoiler alert. You remember I said for the rings that they evolve following this tau disk, which is just the normalized lifetime of the disk. And this tau disk could be linked, I said, to the mass of the ring if you assume Deisaika's prescription for the viscosity, which is probably the best we have for the rings now. Using this relationship, you get that the time derivative of the mass of the ring is proportional to the mass of the rings to the power 3, which is very easy to integrate, and we give this equation of d, the mass of the rings, as a function of the normalized time. And in this equation, you notice that the initial condition is erased after a critical time. On the long term, whatever d node the initial condition is, the mass of the rings is just 1 over the square root of 60 times the normalized time. So the initial mass of the rings is actually unconstrained. We can't know what it was. Fun fact, if you take the time to be 4.5 gigayears, it gives d to be of the order of 10 to the minus 7, which is roughly the mass of the rings now.
Is that where you guys found the formula?
No, I think they got the formula from N-body simulations and also experiments of real interactions between ice cubes in a tidal field of Saturn.
Now, I guess there were various scalings one could use for the viscosity. For example, one might imagine that the rings regulate in some way to a monolayer. They have optical depth of order 1, don't they? So one can imagine, for example, the size of the ring particles is itself a function of time.
Oh.
See, so if it's not a coincidence that it's a monolayer with optical depth of order 1 now, one might imagine that it maintains that property
Right.
as it spreads, right? And so if that were true, then I guess the time scaling would change somewhat.
Possibly.
You're basically taking the viscosity to be the present viscosity.
No, not the present viscosity. Deisaika have studied how a ring of solid particles would behave. And it's not, they have no measure of the viscosity now. So I can't remember how their viscosity depends on the size of the ring, of the particles. It depends on the surface density, it depends on a few other parameters that are well constrained. I'm not sure there is a strong dependence on the size of the ice blocks. Okay, we can.
This one assumes a constant size, right? Because p minus 2 basically have to be.
Daisaka assume a constant size? Okay, thanks.
Well, 'cause,
I would assume that they must.
Because that dispersion velocity comes from 1 over b, and the dispersion velocity squared would be 1 over b squared. Let's assume the dispersion velocity goes like this.
Okay, I see. Okay, right. So this could be indeed something to change. Of course, this is a very simplified, a very easy calculation where I have taken only the dominant term in Daisaka's prescription for the viscosity. They have 3 terms. I've taken only the gravitational one, which dominates when the surface density is huge. But what you see is that whatever d0, all this converges to the mass of the rings now in 4.5 gigahertz, which may or may not be an indication that the rings formed this way, and actually that they could have been maybe 10,000 times more massive in the past. We did simulations of that with Julien Salmon, it was his PhD. He solved the surface density evolution of the rings, which depends on the viscosity, and he had shown that, of course, the less massive the rings are, the slower they spread, and they could survive for gigayears with their present mass, but they could also have been more massive in the past. This is total mass of rings he has obtained in simulations as a function of time for different initial conditions, and they all converge in 1 over square root of time as well. So he did these simulations before we did the analytic calculations, but that's the result, it confirms it. Now, why would they have been more massive? There are a few competing theories about the origin of the rings. The one I personally find maybe more convincing is relatively recent by Canup and Ward. They have assumed that they have developed all this model of formation of satellites within the circumplanetary disk of Saturn, and similarly as planet formation around a star, you have migration of the satellites, and in their model, many satellites get lost. But then 4 years later, Canup thought, wait, if a satellite enters the Roche radius, and if it is differentiated with a dense core and an icy mantle, then only the icy mantle is taken apart by the tides, and the silicate core is dense enough to resist the tides and maybe fall into Saturn. And so her SPH simulations show that you can actually create rings this way. And the sketch here tells you that if you take this differentiated body, you migrate it into the circumplanetary disk inside the Roche limit, in the end, all you get is a massive ring of pure ice, exactly what we want. You get rid of the silicate core inside Saturn.
So there is no Roche radius for the silicates.
The Roche radius for the silicate is at 90,000 kilometers, because they are denser. If you remember the formula for the Roche radius, there was a density at the denominator. And Canup argues that at the time Saturn formed, it was hotter, so it was inflated, so it was 90 kilometers in radius.
Would the strength of the silicates matter at that point? Because there's more forces around than just gravity.
Right.
Not this side. Gravity coming down is going to be a
Yeah, exactly. And so if you take this model, in the end, what you have is not exactly the system we have now. Because for this body to be differentiated, it needed to be massive, like as massive as Titan. So its mantle is huge. So you get very massive ring. This ring is made of pure ice, which is cool, but then it leaves no satellite between the rings and Titan, because this satellite formed at a long distance ago. It migrated, it has pushed everything, and all you have is a massive ring here, formed 4.5 gigayears ago. Well, this is exactly what we want. Because in the end, we have a very massive ring, and we have plenty of time. Concerning the timing, I told you that beyond a certain distance, the satellites are moved by this equation. And in this equation, you see a critical parameter, which is the tidal Q, the efficiency of dissipation inside Saturn, which is poorly known. But you can integrate this equation backwards to find how long it takes to bring the satellites at their present position, starting where the interaction with the rings vanishes, that's at 222,000 kilometers. If you take the standard value for Q of Saturn in the literature, the migration is negligible. But I would like to stress that this standard value has been adopted under the constraint that the satellites should not have moved. So that's consistent. Now, Valéry Lenné has measured the evolution of the orbit of the satellites, and he has deduced a Q value from this. He made a very careful work analyzing old photographic plates and comparing the orbits with what they are now, and he finds that the Q of Saturn should be of the order of 1700, so 10 times less. And with this value, even Rhea is only 3.5 to 4 gigayears old. It's older, younger than the solar system. Dione, Tethys, and Enceladus as well.
Titan has a core, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So Titan could not itself form by this process.
No, unless,
The tides were enough to put it.
absolutely, unless there was some dirt in the ice that accumulated into Titan's core. Titan, if we take this value, should be, you would need 10 billion years to input Titan at its position. According to Valéry Lenné, a factor 2 is acceptable.
Which objects was Lenné looking at?
The mid-sized moons, I could not tell you exactly how many observations of each of them he has, but in his paper he has a Q value with error bars for, I think, these four bodies.
And
And-
they're consistent.
They are all consistent with the constant Q of this value. They are also consistent with the non-uniform Q. There are discussions about how does Q depend on the exciting frequency. It's not clear at all whether it's constant. There may have been accelerations and slowing down of the process at some point, but that's what he gets. I think Rhea seems to have to show an even smaller Q than the others, but it's under discussion. Also, if you notice, the curve here was an increasing curve, which means that the objects are ranked by distance. So Rhea seems to be the older one, so it could have formed first, migrated to its position. Then you would form Dione, 1 billion years later, for instance. It migrates to its position. Then Tethys, and so on. They don't need to cross orbits. That's a cool thing. Also, these mid-sized moons, have irregular cores and a very irregular global composition. So we argue in this paper that this could be the result of a stochasticity in the process. If the rings were not pure ice, there could have been partial differentiation in the parent body, for instance. There would be some chunks of silicates within the rings. Silicates are outside of the Roche limit, so they immediately agglomerate into big chunks. And then these chunks get covered with ice. And if you have, say, 5 such chunks, they would be the core of the 5 mid-sized moons. And of course, if you take just 5 things, it's really dependent on chance. So you could have stochasticity in the composition and the size of these cores. And also it seems that the mid-sized moon have young cratering ages, but this is very much controversial. Cratering in Saturn's system is not well understood, at least not by me, but I think it's a general aspect. So this movie is now going to illustrate a numerical simulation of this process. You will see again a line showing the density profile of the rings, and on the right you will have dots corresponding to the moons. The dissipation in Q is assumed to be 1680, and this is how it's going to look like with the simulated satellites in black dots, and the gray squares are the satellites now. The masses of the satellites can be read on the right axis, and the surface density of the rings is read here. You see that the rings are spreading, so their peak density decreases strongly while they become wider and wider. We start with a very peaked surface density. What you see here is a discrete regime. This moon is growing by step because it's accreting this one. When you see this one going down, it's not going down, it has merged and a new one has formed. And now we're entering the pyramidal regime where we have many moons in the system. So of course the first one is always in the discrete regime, and then these ones are going away, interacting with the rings and with Saturn, and when they approach too close, they merge, and you will see 2 moons disappear and form one larger body. In this simulation, there was a crude estimate of the increase of the eccentricity due to the interactions of the moons and then of the damping of the eccentricity due to the tides. So all these things were taken into account. And as you see, with time, as time goes by, the rings spread and we have a series of satellites forming along a line which is pretty close to the theoretical line for the pyramidal regime. There is some stochasticity events, the profile of the rings can have some steps because of there would be a resonance there. Then the satellites, of course, evolve more or less fast. There is some noise in the perfect pyramidal regime, but in the end, it converges to a system which is very close to the one we know now. There you go. 4.5 billion years, the system.
Do you account for possible E-motion resonances between?
Not in this simulation. And this should be a step forward. Here we don't account for capture in mid-motion resonances. I think this assumption is very reasonable close to the rings. Because close to the rings, the bodies are small, so their mid-motion resonances are weak, and the rings are close, so the torque of the ring is strong and is largely able to overcome the resonances. So these bodies are going to pass by all the resonances until they merge. The further we go, the more massive the bodies are, the less good this approximation is. As Julien Salmon has published a work, or not yet published, but at least he showed it at the DPS, in which capture by mid-motion resonances allows the process to go faster because the inner moon will interact with the rings and will push the outer ones that get caught in the resonance. So it's roughly the same thing. I don't think it changed the mass distance distribution significantly, but it can accelerate the process. And of course, it will change a little bit, but not the big picture. I've been already a bit long, but it's not over yet. Saturn was cool, but there are 8 planets in the solar system. Of them, 6 have satellites. You remember the discrete regime? The condition was, at the end of the discrete regime, the mass of the satellite is smaller than this expression. If you input here the moon forming disk, the mass you get there is the mass of the moon. So our model predicts that if you put a disk around the Earth within the Roche radius, for instance after a big impact, which has about 2% of the mass of the Earth, you should form only one satellite.
What state is this supposed to be in? This is a benchmark myself.
Oh yeah, this disk has absolutely nothing to do with ice blocks. This disk will be molten lava with a thick atmosphere.
Yeah.
So, I mean, taking this is probably inappropriate.
Right.
Nonetheless,
You're taking the same viscosity law as was used for that. That's
yes,
not.
I know. No, I know it's.
So I think your conclusion is, for example, your spreading time is pretty fast.
Well, the funny thing is, when in this viscosity prescription, the dominant part is self-gravity. And self-gravity should also apply to the disk around the Earth. Of course, not the same way exactly, but self-gravity is a process that we find. I agree. But it will become soon flat also because of dissipation. So we will have a disk with roughly a Q of Q, a Toomre Q of the order of 2, also around the Earth. Sébastien Charnoz has done simulations of that. And so it's quite appealing to me that it shows that the mass at the end of the discrete regime increases with the disk mass anyway. And so at some point this mass becomes the disk mass. When the disk spreads fast, the idea is that when the disk spreads fast, the accretion wins over migration. Because the migration of the object away from the ring, you can't do anything about that. But if you feed this body with a lot of fast spreading, this body will grow fast enough that its Roche radius grows, that its Hill radius grows fast enough that it keeps accreting things. And this is what must have happened around the Earth. Maybe it's not exactly the same idea, but all the n-body simulations have shown that only one moon forms, and it forms pretty fast. And if we take the phase value of 100 orbits, that's about 1 month. which is exactly in agreement with the N-body simulation. So I think the basic things behind that is right. And so I consider that we scored a nice goal with that. But I agree with you, there are some limitations. Sorry, you.
Can I ask about this?
Yes.
So you formed this one big moon because of the scaling, but if this has gone down in mass, say a couple of magnitudes, but it's still a little moon that's being formed. You're saying the moon is not moving away fast enough with the tide. It stays around and catch up all the little moons that are formed. Why is it not moving fast enough? I mean, this condition did not.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean with the other small moons.
So the tidal evolution of the moon is really very fast.
Yes.
It's so massive.
Yes, but it's slower than the disk spreading. So in fact, this disk will evolve super quickly, and most of this mass will end up into the moon. And
This mass is going down.
yes,
Right? So spreading time is getting longer and longer.
right, right. But the migration of the moon as well, because the migration of the moon is governed by the disk density too.
But the moon is already formed. Why is it not moving away very fast?
Well, the moon forms, it moves away fast, and it slows down as the rings, as the disk spreads. So the disk spreads into the moon and on the Earth, and at some point, the moon is massive enough to confine the disk, which is less massive, and the disk then eventually spreads into the Earth, and the moon keeps moving away. And this would happen only when most of the mass of the disk has fell into the moon. The key here is that such a disk should not produce many moons like Saturn's rings. If this disk was less massive and spread slowly, because it would be less massive, we would have a lot of moons around the Earth. But we have only one because this disk has been massive.
Can you define a critical value D for the transition from multi-moons to a single
It's
moon?
close to 1% of the central planet mass.
And that just depends on numerical factors.
If you remember the expression for this critical value, it only depends on tau disk, on how fast the disk spreads. This is the critical factor.
Shouldn't it also depend on tidal evolution?
In fact, if you neglect the planetary tides on the satellite and you consider that the satellite being close to the rings is dominated by the effects of the rings, it all simplifies. That's the beauty of these equations. In the end, the single parameter left is the disk lifetime, tau disk.
I agree, but there is a part. But okay, go on. Yes, sorry.
I think when we are close to the disk, when delta is small, it dominates quite largely. I don't remember, I have done the calculations. Delta, the rings tide dominate up to delta of 0.1 for massive disks as massive as 10 to minus 3 the mass of the planet, I think. I should check. It's in the supplementary material of our paper. So back to the pyramidal regime now. We have a nice fit with Saturn's system, at least I think. And so just out of curiosity, here are the satellites of Uranus in green and Neptune in blue. Same distribution. I have plotted them as a function of their distance to the Roche radius of Uranus and the Roche radius of Neptune. And I have divided the mass of these satellites by the mass of the central planet. They follow the same distribution. For Neptune, it's an amazing fit, except for this satellite, which seems to be 3 times too massive. And for Uranus, there is a lot of scatter, which could be explained by the chaotic dynamics of the Uranus system, which would add some orbit crossing and some merging that are clearly away of the ideal pyramidal regime. But the gross tendency follows the same law. Uranus has no big satellites here, and Neptune doesn't have tiny satellites here, as far as we know. And so I claim that Uranus and Neptune used to have massive rings, even more massive than Saturn. And from these massive rings, the regular satellites of Uranus and Neptune were born. Now these rings have disappeared. There's only tiny remnants left in terms of rings around Uranus and Neptune. But this distribution of the mass and distance of the satellites of Uranus and Neptune is, in my opinion, the smoking gun that this process happened.
Well, I guess I don't understand this theory. Neptune clearly the satellites have a smaller mass relative to the planet. Or
Yes.
the spot is Saturn.
Yes.
So evolution is slower.
Yes.
Tidal evolution is slower. So then why are the rings less massive in that case?
You mean the original ring from which
Well,
they
obviously the original rings might be supposed to be less massive because
Yes.
the satellites are. That's obviously a free parameter. But
Exactly.
given that you start with a lower mass set of rings,
Yes.
wouldn't they have an easier time surviving?
Yes. So the question is, why did they disappear?
Yeah.
I know, it's an open question to me. This is something we have thought of working on as soon as we have found this. Obviously, before this, no one thought there had been massive rings around Uranus and Neptune. So it's not a question that has been addressed in the literature where we could find answers. The question why these rings have disappeared is indeed a key question. But I suspect they have existed, and this would be the proof, and we have to understand how they disappeared. A possibility could be that the Neptunian and Uranian tides are pulling the satellite inwards, because the synchronous orbit of Uranus and Neptune is much further than the Roche radius, in contrary to what happens around Saturn. So this adds some torque inwards, which could have been transferred from the satellite onto the rings. It may be a part of the story, but it may not be everything. I don't know. But this is a difference between these systems. The location of the synchronous orbit, it may play a role. Now, about Phobos and Deimos, this is absolutely new. Here is the system of Mars. Roughly to scale, Mars is here, the Roche radius is 2.5 Martian radii away, and Phobos is orbiting very close to the Roche radius, while Deimos is at about 7 Martian radii, quite far. This is the location of the synchronous orbit, so everything that orbits beyond that is moving away due to Martian tides, and everything that is inside this is migrating inwards due to Martian tides, and actually Phobos is going to crash onto Mars, or more likely to be destroyed by tides, actually quite soon in the age of the solar system, in a few million years. And this is where the 2-to-1 mean motion resonance is with the Roche radius. So it means beyond this blue circle, Martian tides the tides, the effects of the rings would vanish. So if you have rings around Mars, as soon as you reach this distance, you are only subject to Mars tides, and they are pulling you inwards. So when we have seen this, we said, well, so for Phobos and Deimos, it's impossible to formally directly win the pyramidal regime. Actually, mainly for Deimos, it's just no way we reach the synchronous orbit and Deimos, and Phobos being alone doesn't look like pyramidal regime. But if you integrate back in time the evolution of Phobos, it may have been somewhere around here 4.5 gigayears ago. And if you make the calculation of where the resonances are with the 2-to-1 resonance with the Roche radius, that's where you have the 2-to-3 and the 2-to-1, roughly. So what Sébastien Charnoz suggests, and this is a work that is in press at the moment, I'm not co-author of, so I'm really doing advertisement for my colleague here. Imagine a giant impact has created a massive ring within the Roche radius of Mars. Say the massive impact you would need to create the northern hemisphere and the dichotomy on Mars. You would probably also have debris beyond the Roche radius. So Sébastien and his colleagues have modeled a massive ring inside the Roche radius and a tiny ring of debris outside of it. Then, from the massive ring inside the Roche radius, satellites form in the pyramidal regime. They evolve all the way to the 2-to-1 resonance. And then the resonances with these bodies go through the small disk of debris here, and they pile material there and there. And this is what they get. Here is the semi-major axis as a function of time since the formation of since the beginning of the process. The largest inner moon forming from the massive ring of debris which was within the Roche radius goes this way. And that's the resonances with it. And all the debris are piled up, and in the end you get 2 with the good masses. That's a small animation showing this, where the resonances, as they go through this disk of debris, actually do create two bodies. And in this case, in this simulation, the inner one is more massive than the outer one, which corresponds very well to the Phobos and Deimos case. So maybe even for Mars, this thing has happened. So to summarize everything, the spreading of a tidal disk, a ring maintained by tides, beyond the Roche radius can explain the mass distance distribution of the giant planets for the regular satellites of the giant planets. And it may be an observational signature of this process, in my view, because this mass distance relation is really peculiar. And it kind of unifies terrestrial and giant planets in the same paradigm. Because with the same idea that mass is flowing through the Roche radius, you can either form one big satellite if it's fast, or a series of small satellites if it's slow. And you can even get Phobos and Deimos. In the end, most solar system regular satellites form this way. I should mention that Jupiter does not fit in this picture at all. The Galilean moon do not follow this law. And Titan, yes, fits well with the line. It's an open question. So with this, I would thank you very much for your attention from this tiny blue spot here, which is actually where we are now, the Earth, as seen by Cassini.